transit-oriented development, and a little bit about various other related issues about Singapore's transport and land use planning and how they interact with each other. That's the key theme. So the way that I usually talk about that is by highlighting this idea that Singapore is a new transit city. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. There's some images that are probably already familiar. And so along the way, feel free to ask questions if something I say is unfamiliar, if there's a word or a term that you need explained. First, we'll talk about some basic principles so that you know the key themes that I'll be trying to emphasize. Then we'll do some history of Singapore with respect to transport and land use, transport and urban planning. Especially focusing on the early 1970s. It was the early 1970s when Singapore made some big decisions and changed direction in transport and planning especially. And then we'll look at the more recent issues, which maybe CLC probably already talked about that. At CLC, did you hear about the old history very much?
A little bit, but very old.
Very big picture.
Very big picture.
Okay. So this image is of the 1971 concept plan. They may have mentioned that. That was a very important document and a very important exercise, a very important planning exercise that went into that. So I will emphasize that. Just trying to be quiet. Okay. Okay, so I said I was going to explain this concept of a new transit city. So if we think about cities that arrived in middle income status but without mass transit. Okay, so I'm not talking about cities like Tokyo or New York or London or Sydney, where when people became middle income, when the city became on average middle income, they already had a big network of railways. Okay? Even before cars were around, they had a lot of railways. Whereas Singapore, Seoul, most Indian cities, most Chinese cities, most Thai cities, at the time when cars arrived, so in Thailand cars became very popular in the 1980s and 90s. So cars were coming in, motorcycles were coming in, but there was almost no mass transit. Maybe a very old railway system, but almost nothing. So it's cities like that we're talking about. And Singapore was also like that. In the 1960s and 70s, cars and motorcycle ownership started to rise, but there was no mass transit. So cities like that, what happens? It's a problem because the congestion can become severe. When you have no mass transit to give people an alternative, the buses get stuck in traffic. And so public transport deteriorates very fast. Whereas in London or Sydney or New York City, even if car ownership rose, the public transport system can continue to function. It does suffer, but it doesn't completely collapse, and it doesn't go into a spiral, a death spiral. So the problem for this kind of city is that when large numbers of cars and motorcycles enter, they become what we can call traffic-saturated cities, where they've got these severe problems. The public transport system is not functioning well. There's no mass transit that is immune from from congestion. The congestion is a huge problem for cities like this. Whereas for Tokyo is a congested city. There is traffic congestion, but it is not such a severe problem for Tokyo to have congestion, because many people can choose an alternative to go on public transport, on the railways. Okay, traffic-saturated city. So Bangkok in the 1990s and maybe even now, was an excellent example of a very, very traffic-saturated city. Jakarta now, or Manila now, or Delhi now, are traffic-saturated cities. Now, this idea of a new transit city is different from an old transit city. So New York City, Tokyo, London, Sydney, they are old transit cities that cars came into, and now they are a mix. But Tokyo, you could say, is an old transit city, even now. Singapore is a new transit city because it used to be a traffic-saturated city, but it chose to become a transit city. But it was new. It was after the car era it became a transit city. That's what I mean by new transit city. Even after cars and motorcycles have come in, you try hard to become a transit city. And there's a number of examples. Seoul is an example. The big Chinese cities like Shanghai are also examples. And it's not easy. It's not easy to become a new transit city. Once there's a lot of cars and motorcycles, you have a big problem. And once people become used to using cars and motorcycles, it's difficult to tempt them to switch back to public transport or to use their car less. It's not an easy thing to do. So cities that have done this have had to use very powerful tools. For example, they restrain car use. So later on we'll talk about how Singapore did that. It's easier to do that if you do it early, before there are too many cars. If you do it after there are a lot of cars, it's harder. Okay? But we see around the world, we see examples of cities that did it early. So Singapore started to do this early, when there were about 100 cars per 1,000 people. Whereas Seoul started this later, after there were about almost 200 cars per 1,000 people. So that was harder for them. And of course, cities like my own city of Adelaide, cities like Phoenix or Atlanta in the United States, or Perth in Australia, chose an extreme, the exact opposite strategy. They said cars are coming in, and they said, okay, we like cars. And we are rich, so we have enough money, we can build big roads. We are rich, so we have enough money, so we can spread our city out, and everybody can live in bungalows. Almost nobody lives in apartments. It's a very, very low density city. Adelaide has 1.2 million people, but it's 40 kilometres to the north, 40 kilometres to the south, 30 kilometres east and west, so it's a very, very low density city. My wife from Singapore visited Adelaide and said, where's all the people? You call this a city? There's nobody here. Where are they? So that's an automobile-dependent city. The most extreme examples are places like Houston or Atlanta in the United States, where you have a huge network of expressways, plus very low density housing, and jobs are not clustered in the city centre anymore. There are some in the city centre, but there are jobs here, there are jobs there, there are jobs everywhere. And most people drive to work. 95% of trips are by car, work trips. And those are the extreme cases, but there are cities in between. So somewhere like Boston in the United States, Bangkok now is now somewhere in between. It's still rather traffic saturated, but you wouldn't say it's like Singapore becoming a new transit city yet, but you wouldn't say it's... In the early 1990s, I would have said Bangkok was trying to become a car city. Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia also. But now, both Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia and Bangkok are maybe not quite going this way, but they're somewhere in between. They realise that this is maybe a mistake, and they're trying to have some kind of balance maybe. So there's things in between as well. But Singapore is a fairly good example of this situation. Now, some cities if there's an economic setback. And so if you're rich, you can invest in either public transport or expressways or both. But if you become a traffic saturated city, but then you have some economic, slow economic growth times, you may become stuck in this traffic saturated situation. So for maybe 2 decades, Manila was like that. And now it's starting to grow again, and we'll see which way it goes. Okay, so Singapore, what were the sort of key themes in cities that became new transit cities? They were traffic saturated, but they tried to escape traffic saturation by investing in public transport, by limiting car use and car ownership, maybe, sometimes both. They were very keen to plan the city to suit public transport. And so you heard from CLC about that, the transit-oriented concept plans in Singapore. And in some places, there's also a softer idea of, why are we restricting cars? Well, in some places they emphasize it's for the sake of having a livable city, a comfortable city. Now, Singapore now is doing that, but in the 1970s they didn't talk about that. In 1970s Singapore, this was Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore, it was all about efficiency, economic development. We're going from third world to first world very fast. We're not worried about all of this soft stuff, right? It's hard development. We want to develop fast. We want to become rich fast. It's not about livability and making Singapore a nice place. We want it to be an efficient place, a super efficient place. So Singapore was a bit of an exception there. So that last one was not emphasized much in Singapore until the 1990s. And since then it's become more important. But those first three, by the way, the public transport part, it's not just about investing in public transport, even in Singapore. Okay? It might seem that the most important thing about public transport is we built MRT. Maybe you think that's the most important thing. I'll be explaining the history a little bit, and I want to emphasize that building the MRT was only part of the story. There was a lot more that Singapore did to improve public transport. Long before they built MRT, they improved the buses in very significant ways. Okay? So don't forget about buses. Okay. We'll be emphasizing the transit-oriented planning today because that's your main interest, I believe. So some background, some sort of fundamental issues that you need to understand. The key reason why having a traffic-saturated city is a problem is because cars take up a lot of space. They take up a lot of space on the road, and they take up a lot of space when they're waiting for you, when they're parked. And in some ways, it's actually more space for the parking than for the space on the road. Now, this is not a very scientific image, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the difference. There are more scientific graphs I could have shown you, which would also emphasize the difference, but this is a sort of a dramatic illustration. Another reason space and space efficiency is important is that if you want public transport to be successful, you need a certain amount of density. You need people to be close together, jobs to be close together. Otherwise, public transport will have a really hard time being efficient and effective. It will be very difficult to justify high-frequency buses or investments in mass transit if there's not enough customers. Even if we subsidise, it's still difficult to justify. The cost-benefit analysis is just bad. But if you have enough density, then public transport can be successful. So there's a clash there. If you want to make a city for cars, you have to spread it out because cars need a lot of space. You can't have a city with most people using cars if it's high density. That's a recipe for disaster, for congestion, for pollution, for a horrible city. So if you want a lot of cars, you have to spread out, like Atlanta, like Adelaide, like Perth, like Houston. But if you spread out, then your public transport can't function. Your public transport will die. It's also stuck in the traffic, so it's dying for two reasons. So cities that started to go down that path and the cars are coming in, to rescue the situation, they sometimes say, okay, let's try to make sure we can have density, at least let's have high density of residences and jobs and activities. Let's have high density near good public transport, especially near junctions. Interchange stations are especially important to have high density. But any station can have higher than average density. And if you are a car city and you have a congestion problem, the solution is usually, let's spread things out to reduce the congestion. Let's make it illegal to have high density, because high density will cause congestion. If everybody is going to a place by car, you have to make sure that place is low density, otherwise it will be a disaster. If you are trying to head the other way towards transit city solution, then when you have a congested place, instead of spreading it out, you will allow it to stay high density or get even more dense, but you will try to improve the alternatives like public transport, walking, cycling, taxis, Uber, etc. All of those alternatives are more space efficient than private cars. Taxis and Uber are more space efficient than private cars because there's one big difference between them. They don't need to park at the destination, right? If you go to work and you leave your car near your office for 10 hours while you work, that's a huge amount of space. But if you caught a taxi, even though in the traffic you're still causing congestion, but at least you're not taking up a huge amount of space and making this transit-oriented place spread out. Okay, so this theme of transit-oriented development has two sides to it. One is improving the transit, plus those other alternatives. Okay, so there's no point having a transit-oriented development if there's no transit, no public transport. It won't work. And it's not just public transport. Bicycles, walking, etc. And it's also about the density and the urban design, so that you have a land use pattern, you have a style of development that is compatible with people arriving by public transport or bicycle or walking and walking around within the area. Some people will still arrive by car, but you need to be careful that that traffic does not destroy the transit-oriented pattern. Can you still hear me? Even with a little bit of coughing, it's okay. So, never mind. It's the flu season in Chiang Mai.
Do you want the mic?
I'm okay, but it's just, if I am a bit soft, it's hard for me to tell. Do you think I should use the mic, or is it okay?
It's okay.
It's okay. Okay, so I think, who of you is not familiar with the idea of transit-oriented development already? So you're already pretty familiar. I don't need to. Oh, it's a new thing for some of you. Okay. Okay. So no harm in talking a little bit about it.
Yeah, we've suffered a lot.
You've suffered a lot already.
So we named it.
Okay. So I emphasised that public transport. That transit-oriented development was about density, right? Enough jobs, enough people, enough activities in a small space. But it's also about other details of urban design. Okay, so things like mixed uses. Just having super high density but only offices is a mistake. Or super high density but only houses, that's also a mistake. Right? Much better to have a mix of land uses at each of your transit-oriented nodes. That allows many, many trips to be very short trips by foot or bicycle, so that it's not all on public transport. Walkability is a complicated issue. There's many aspects of walkability, but something that you should have in mind when you're building and designing transit-oriented development is how easy is it to walk within the development? How seamless and easy and permeable is walking between that development and other developments? Can people walk through a development to get to the other side? So walkability is about all of those things. The street layouts can make a big difference to how walkable a place is. So generally speaking, an old-fashioned grid is much more walkable than this kind of thing, unless every single one of these or most of these plots are permeable. So if you look around Singapore, the HDB, the public housing landscapes, if you look at them in Google Maps or something, some of them will look like this kind of layouts, and it looks like it's not terribly walkable in terms of what we usually expect. But HDB is permeable. It's open to the public. Anyone can walk through. So even if it looks like this, I can still walk across it. So sometimes it's misleading. But if it was private sector condominiums that look like this, then those condos are blocking permeability. There's a few other issues, but I already mentioned transit-oriented development needs transit. I'm going to talk about be on the way in a minute.
How is the maximum length for the people who walk between? How is the
maximum? Okay, so that's a very good question. And how long is a piece of string? Is the answer. There's no specific answer to the question, how long is a piece of string, right? There are short strings and long strings. So there's no specific answer to that, but there are sort of guidelines. But it depends. In a cool climate where you have very attractive, walkable landscapes where people have shade or interesting shop fronts to walk past, people are willing to walk a long distance. Maybe 1 kilometre from their car to their destination, or 1 kilometre from the subway station or MRT station to their destination. But if you have a noisy, traffic-filled road, nothing interesting to look at, the sun is beating down on you or it's rainy, then people are willing to walk very, very short distances. You've got an umbrella and you're walking. It's unpleasant. So if you design the environment to be walkable, people will walk longer distances. But some rules of thumb, the transit-oriented development zone is generally 800 meters. So in America they say half a mile, right? It's about 800 meters. A mile is 1.6 kilometers. But the most intense TOD, high density TOD area is about within 400 meters of the station. So those are rules of thumb. But you won't get people walking 800 meters unless you make it easy and comfortable. So one of the things Singapore does is have sheltered walkways. Maybe you've seen from bus stops or 2 bus stops and all around MRT stations, lots of sheltered walkways. Yeah. And that's part of the strategy, is to make it comfortable for people to walk through. So I'd better keep moving. One mistake that developers and planners often make with transit-oriented development is, suppose this is the main road through an area, okay? And then someone says, I want to make TOD and I'm going to put it over there, 700 meters or 500 meters from this road. This is where the public transport is going to be, almost inevitably. It's either bus, maybe BRT, bus rapid transit. Even if mass transit gets built, chances are it will follow the main road because that's the easier place to build. That's where there's already probably some reasonable density near that road. If you build your TOD over there and try to make the buses go in and out, that's a recipe for very, very weak public transport. You're ruining those bus routes by making them divert. You make them less attractive to use. And you're guaranteeing that most people will want to go there by motorcycle or car, not by bus or mass transit. So if you're going to do TOD, put it on the way from somewhere to somewhere else, on the main corridors where people already travel. A few more details. Now, you may not have a choice as real estate developers. You're at the mercy of the urban planning rules, right? And those urban planning rules may force you to have big setbacks. They may force you to have huge amounts of car parking. But you can lobby the city council, the city government, to reduce the setbacks, reduce the side setbacks, eliminate the parking minimum requirements, or at least lower them or make them more flexible, give you more choices about how much parking and where to put it. So in your lobbying, you should lobby for this kind of, the kind of rules that allow you to build 5 or 6 stories right near the street. That's transit oriented. Buildings with big setbacks is much, much less transit oriented. Now I have to say Singapore is not perfect in this case. You probably see a lot of buildings even in the city centre with big setbacks, and some of Singapore's details are not as transit oriented as I would like. So we're not necessarily perfect at everything. We're pretty good, right? I've got to say that we're cheating. But we don't get everything right? Even Singapore makes mistakes. A brief word about parking. If you visit the United States or Australia and you go to the newer parts, so places that were built in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and you go along a main road, you're likely to see a landscape like this with most of what you'll see immediately next to the road is parking. And you'll see buildings behind the parking lots, way off behind the parking lots. So, huge big box shops. You may see office complexes, maybe office parks, set in a sort of ocean of parking. And this is the precise opposite of transit-oriented development. Okay? This is as far from transit-oriented development as you can possibly have. But let's think about the parking. So this is this kind of landscape is also such that this parking is not just public parking, right? This is the parking for this office building. This is the parking for this shop. This is the parking for the school. This is the parking for this park. If you park here and walk into the park, the chances are some security guard from the office building will say, no, you can't do that. This is our parking, not the park's parking. Go park in the park's parking. Even if you are an employee here, well, suppose you're shopping and then you decide to visit your child's school and talk to the teacher or something. That's also a no-no. You're supposed to park at the place you go to. And if you move somewhere else, you're supposed to bring your car with you. So there's lots of short trips between things, even if you can't just park once and then walk around. It's much more compatible with transit-oriented development to design like this. Some things won't have their own parking. Maybe they have zero parking with a particular building, but there's public parking. Or even if a building has parking, it opens its parking to the public. So if you go to the city centre of Singapore, most office buildings, or all newer office buildings, and all newer residential buildings and commercial buildings, retail buildings, hotels, they all have parking, and they all open at least some of it. Some of them open most of their parking to the public. So you'll see prices, and you'll see a gantry, and you can go in. Now, some of the parking will be for tenants and residents, but there'll be a lot of parking open to the public. So this is conducive to park once and then you can walk around. Nobody's going to chase you out because you park there and go to some other building. They don't care because you're paying for your parking. Now, of course, they hope you'll come into business, but they don't mind. So it's mixed use. It means there's much less short car trips, much fewer short car trips, because people can just park their car and then they walk around the neighbourhood instead of parking their car, then driving again, parking again, driving again, parking again on this side. Here it's arrive in the neighbourhood, park your car, leave it there, walk around, and then go later. Okay. So that was transit-oriented development, a very, very brief discussion at a local, fine scale, right? The small scale. There's also transit-oriented development at the metropolitan scale, the scale of the whole metropolitan area, the whole city. And so Singapore has been pretty good at both scales of transit-oriented development. So this is an example of concept plans at slightly different years. Usually it's once every 10 years or so Singapore does a concept plan. The concept plan is the big picture strategic plan. It's not the master plan, the detailed plan. It's the big picture plan. And they have transit-oriented centres of activity. So Singapore has several big sub-centres that are not the city centre. I'll talk more about them in a little minute. But those sub-centres are planned to be very transit-oriented, easy to get to by public transport. And at an intermediate scale, each of these corridors is like a string of beads with transit-oriented development around each station. So that you've got several scales of transit-oriented development. Now, is Singapore a super high-density city? Depending on where you go, you may get that impression, right? If you had come and you'd travelled around Singapore primarily by MRT, you'll probably get the impression Singapore is very high density. It's almost like Hong Kong, not quite. But if you travel around by car or your coach, you see some low density areas, like around here, right? It's quite low density. Although along the main road you see high rise. But if you go in behind, you'll see low density. So Singapore's a mix. It's not actually super high density. Places like Vietnamese, big cities, Ho Chi Minh, Hanoi, are much higher density, even though they're low rise, because everything's very close together. Mumbai, very high density. Cairo, that's super high density. Singapore is pretty dense, and Singapore is unusual in one respect. It's a city that has been gradually increasing its density. I don't mean the overall average density, the total land use